This is Unfuck the Poor. I'm Joe Love. It's January 25th, 2026. Yesterday, ICE agents in Minneapolis, Minnesota, shot 37-year-old Alex Peretti. No doubt you've seen the footage, and no doubt you've seen analysis that shows agents disarmed him before shooting him multiple times in the back. And no doubt you've heard all the lies from DHS Secretary Kristi Noem and the Oompa Loompa who's always picked last at kickball, Greg Bovino. I've put off recording the rest of this series simply because I've been watching what's been unfolding across the United States and especially in Minneapolis. Seems a little silly to be talking about the history of fascism while we're in the middle of a fascist takeover in our own country. But after yesterday's murder, I think the rest of this series has actually become more relevant. Today's episode is mostly about George Lincoln Rockwell and the rise of the American Nazi Party in the 1950s through the 1960s. Rockwell was also an insecure little man, just like Greg Bovino, sexually frustrated, psychopathic, and in general just a chronic dildo. And just like you've been hearing your entire life, in order to understand what's happening now, we have to understand our history. So, back to fascism and anti-fascism in the United States. If you recall from the last episode, for European anti-fascists who went underground, the lessons from World War I and World War II would not be forgotten. Anti-fascists kept the message simple. Don't wait to respond, don't rely on the state or police to intervene, and don't hesitate to cross the divide to form a united front. The black and red flag, the symbol of unity between communists and anarchists today, is the descendant of anti-fascistische action's dual red flags that symbolize the theoretical alliance between the Communist Party and the Social Democrat Party. These lessons would be passed down through European communities in the second half of the 20th century and helped combat a resurgence of Nazism in the 1960s and helped establish proactive autonomous movements that were willing and able to quickly respond to new wave fascism. But in the United States, once World War II ended, so too did the need for anti-fascist rhetoric and propaganda. The U.S. had adopted anti-fascism as a means to mobilize troops against a common enemy, and then they defeated that enemy. Anti-fascism was no longer a necessity, it was simply the default state of American democracy. But the United States still had a Nazi problem. While the German-American Bund, a sanctioned Nazi party in the U.S. that grew to 25,000 members from 1936 to 1941, they officially disbanded after Germany declared war on the United States. But the post-war era in the United States would see the rise of a new American Nazi party headed by George Lincoln Rockwell in 1959. The ANP was completely unaffiliated with the defunct German-American Bund, which had mostly existed to build support for the Nazi Party in Germany. However, even though Rockwell wouldn't establish the American Nazi Party until 1959, he had fully embraced Nazism by 1951, just 6 years after World War II had ended. Rockwell was a Navy pilot and flew anti-submarine missions in World War II in both the European and Pacific theaters. And during the Korean War, he was stationed in San Diego to train pilots. Rockwell has been described as high-strung and edgy, and in high school was not a very good student. Apparently, enlisting in the Navy satisfied a sort of nervous energy, and he was initially drawn into the armed services by the prospect of fighting fascists. But the military shift from anti-fascism to anti-communism during the Korean War really sunk in with Rockwell. During his time training pilots in San Diego, Rockwell began to participate in political activities. He got involved with Douglas MacArthur's presidential bid, and he associated with conspiracy theorists who linked McCarthy's fevered obsession with communism to a global Jewish conspiracy. A woman he met during this time, whom he either doesn't remember the name of or he doesn't want to give the name of, introduced him to the anti-Semitic magazine Common Sense and gave him a ticket to attend the 1950 Christian Nationalist Party convention in Los Angeles to hear Gerald L.K. Smith speak. Gerald Smith was a total piece of shit anti-Semite Disciples of Christ minister who founded the Christian Nationalist Crusade in 1942 and the America First Party in 1944, under which he ran for president. Rockwell was enthralled by Smith, whose training as a minister put a religious vocal emphasis on his extreme beliefs. Rockwell is particularly moved by this emphatic combination of spirituality and hatred, something that will become a theme in his own speeches and writing. Another prominent American Nazi present at the 1950 convention was lawyer Francis Yockey, who was a fugitive at the time under suspicion of sharing top-secret documents with German defense lawyers while working as a post-trial review attorney at the Nuremberg trials. Just some foreshadowing here. All of these people are assholes. By George Rockwell's own admission, he became fully radicalized in 1951 after reading Mein Kampf, writing about his revelation upon reading, quote, "Here I found abundant mental sunshine, which bathed all the gray world suddenly in the clear light of reason and understanding. word after word, sentence after sentence stabbed into the darkness like thunderclaps and lightning bolts of revelation, tearing and ripping away the cobwebs of more than 30 years of darkness, brilliantly illuminating the mysteries of the heretofore impenetrable murk in a world gone mad. I was transfixed, hypnotized. I wondered at the utter, indescribable genius of it. I realized that National Socialism, the iconoclastic worldview of Adolf Hitler, was the doctrine of scientific racial idealism, actually a new religion. End quote. For Rockwell's personal history, I'm going to jump around a little bit. He gets married twice, and I'm not going to talk about his first wife just yet. We're going to sort of jump ahead to his second wife, because the Navy transferred Rockwell to Iceland in 1952 to serve as an F-8F Bearcat pilot in the Atlantic standoff between Iceland and the UK over disputed fishing territories in what is actually officially known as the Cod Wars. Rockwell married an Icelandic woman in 1953, and the new couple took their honeymoon in Berchtesgaden, Germany, and made a pilgrimage to the Eagle's Nest, Hitler's nearby mountain retreat. If Berchtesgaden sounds familiar to regular listeners, you'll recall that Peter Ruckman also enjoyed spending time in Hitler's favorite mountain town. Ruckman and Rockwell are separated by nearly 3 decades. They have no direct connection, but it is at least interesting that bigots enjoy taking pilgrimages to Hitler's mountain retreat. While radicalized early, Rockwell kept his anti-Semitic and white nationalist beliefs mostly secret. He was still technically an enlisted man, but he had returned to civilian life. He was an illustrator, publisher, sign painter, writer. Rockwell tried a number of ways to make ends meet, but he studied Jewish conspiracies to the point that he felt a real spiritual enlightenment with white supremacist beliefs. Another thing happened in Rockwell's head in the winter of 1958 when he kept having recurring dreams that always ended with him meeting Hitler. Perhaps believing that the dreams were Hitler himself appearing to him from across the spiritual realm, Rockwell took these dreams as a sign that it was time to take his extremist beliefs public and to enact social and political change in favor of white nationalism. These dreams were probably the result of constantly rereading Mein Kampf and staring at the swastika banner and plaque of Hitler in his living room. I'm not kidding. And yet, it's also entirely possible that Rockwell made up the whole thing. Based on what I gather is a pattern of mental illness in the American Nazi Party, most members in the ANP had, quote, family problems, a history of petty juvenile delinquency, social problems, most of which stem from mental imbalance. Rockwell's second wife, Thora, was from a prominent family in Iceland. Her father was a chairman for Royal Dutch Shell, and she was described by her family as a free spirit who ultimately found herself in a bad situation when her husband turned out to be a Nazi. Rockwell and Thora moved to Arlington, Virginia to be closer to Washington, D.C., where Rockwell hoped his beliefs and political aspirations could flourish. Up until 1958, Rockwell had been involved in right-wing groups and hid his Nazi beliefs behind a more palatable facade, working for campaigns and publications and advertising firms, and moving all over the country. His early attempts at dog whistling to draw supporters to his cause didn't work. He just kept attracting run-of-the-mill racists who didn't want to take action on their beliefs. Rockwell believed the majority of conservatives were cowards for not openly expressing the racist beliefs that they whispered about in private but would never act on. Rockwell called them, quote, hobbyists. In April 1958, Rockwell was living in a trailer in Newport News, Virginia, and working as a cartoonist for The Virginian, a pro-segregationist magazine funded in part by the UK-based neo-Nazi group the Northern League. While working at The Virginian, Rockwell met affluent anti-Semite Harold Aerosmith Jr., who had been having a hard time finding a publisher for his own anti-Semitic writings based on research he had been doing at the Library of Congress, National Archives, Department of State, and at the British Foreign Office in England. Aerosmith was a wealthy heir who did not work and also purchased subscriptions to The Virginian for all sitting congressmen and many government officials. Aerosmith and Rockwell made a sensible pair. Aerosmith had the means to purchase a printing press, but needed someone to run it. Rockwell, disaffected with simple conservatism and wanting a full-throated Nazi party, needed a partner with money to back him. Aerosmith determined that Rockwell had, quote, very good anti-Semitic ideas and was a gifted political cartoonist as well as a commercial printer, end quote. Aerosmith purchased $6,000 worth of printing equipment as well as a home for Rockwell in Arlington, Virginia, where he could set up the press and live. Rockwell and Aerosmith also formed the National Committee to Free America from Jewish Domination, Rockwell was the son of vaudeville performers, and Rockwell believed that in addition to publishing their own materials, they needed to perform publicity stunts that would get coverage in local and national press. Aerosmith agreed and started writing checks. In response to the Lebanon crisis, Aerosmith funded and Rockwell organized an anti-Jewish march in Washington, D.C. on July 29, 1958, protesting Jewish influence on foreign policy. Israel at the time supported providing military aid to Lebanon. Rockwell organized concurrent marches in Atlanta and Louisville, giving the impression of a broader anti-Jewish coalition. Now, a few months later, on Sunday, October 12, 1958, the Hebrew Benevolent Congregation Temple in Atlanta, Georgia, was bombed at 3:30 in the morning, resulting in no injuries or deaths. 5 suspects were arrested the next day. One suspect, Kenneth Griffin, confessed to assisting with the bombing and told investigators that another suspect, George Bright, had built the bomb and was responsible for planning the attack. Griffin also named J.B. Stoner as the man who provided the dynamite for the attack, but had left the state. More on Stoner in a bit, because he's an asshole. The 5 suspects were members of the Knights of the White Camellia, a southern white supremacist organization similar to the KKK. George Bright was sent to trial twice, the first one resulting in a hung jury, and the second ending in acquittal. And ultimately, none of the other suspects went to trial. One of Bright's lawyers was James R. Venable, at the time, the imperial wizard of the KKK. So why are we suddenly talking about the Atlanta synagogue bombing? Because the New York Times reported that one of the suspects arrested in connection with the bombing, Wallace Allen, had in his possession a letter from George Rockwell dated July 1958 that read, quote, "The big blast is all set for either next Sunday or Saturday. We want to have Saturday to pass out thousands of handbills and put up posters to sort of steam things up for the big blow itself." End quote. In his statement to reporters, Rockwell clarified that he had been referring to the July anti-Jewish demonstration that he had coordinated with Aerosmith. In Atlanta, that demonstration occurred outside the offices of the Atlanta Constitution with signs that read "Free America from Jewish Domination." Rockwell, I think, was technically truthful. Rockwell's protest in front of the White House occurred on Tuesday, July 29th, while according to FBI testimony from Aerosmith, the protests in Louisville and Atlanta occurred over the weekend of the 26th and 27th. However, Rockwell's answer ignores the nature of their connection altogether. Why did Rockwell coordinate the July protest with Wallace Allen specifically? The answer is that much earlier in 1958, after Aerosmith had procured the printing press for Rockwell, Rockwell was recruited along with Wallace Allen and George Bright by J.B. Stoner and Edward Fields to help establish the National States Right Party, and Stoner and Fields were located in Atlanta. Stoner and Fields are major pieces of shit, and their association dated back to 1952, when Fields joined Stoner's Christian anti-Jewish party. Rockwell provided pamphlets, signs, and stickers, as well as strategic support for the Atlanta-based NSRP. Now, back to J.B. Stoner, the founder of the National States Rights Party, who was ratted out by Kenneth Griffin as the person responsible for supplying the 40 sticks of dynamite used in the synagogue bombing. Stoner would be convicted in 1977 for the 1958 bombing of the Bethel Baptist Church, and he was suspected to have coordinated over a dozen temple and school bombings throughout the 1950s and 60s. The FBI suspected that he was also involved in the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., but they could never prove it. He even served as the attorney for King's assassin, James Earl Ray. Stoner was a lifelong hateful piece of shit, having revived his local KKK chapter in Chattanooga at age 18. A lawyer and psychopath, Stoner performed a version of bigoted Southern revivals to inflame racial tensions as a counter to the civil rights movement. He ran for office repeatedly, calling himself, quote, "the candidate of love," and calling Adolf Hitler a moderate during the 1970 Democratic primary for Georgia governor. He lost the primary to Jimmy Carter, who was not a piece of shit. Now, back to Rockwell. Rockwell's name kept popping up in connection with the synagogue bombing, and his connection to the Atlanta men suspected and arrested for the bombing was well established. FBI homed in on Rockwell and as a result got to Aerosmith. Now, Rockwell was happy to be named in international news. Aerosmith was not. Rockwell's wife, Thora, was also not a fan of the attention. Rockwell's house became a target for protesters and rock throwers. His house wasn't hard to find, you just had to look for the giant swastika. Again, I'm not kidding. Up until the synagogue bombing and its aftermath, Thora Rockwell was, per Rockwell, a devoted wife who was fully aware of his ideas of racial purity and his deep commitment to radicalizing the cowardly, secretly racist Conservative Party. She helped in typing and printing flyers and newsletters. She watched their kids while Rockwell wrote for 8 hours a day in their tiny trailer. And in general, she encouraged Rockwell to persist and believe that he was destined to be a great man. The children ran in and out of that trailer, playing in the mud and tracking it through, and Thora looked her husband in the eyes and told him she understood his political passion, and when he told her that he loved her and the kids the most, but that politics and race took precedence, she was hurt, but did not protest. It was only when faced with the consequences of their actions that she understood Rockwell was dead serious. In the aftermath of the synagogue bombing, Rockwell describes nightly assaults with cherry bombs, one landing in his daughter's bedroom through an open window and exploding, his son having rocks thrown at him at school, and a car veering off the street and tearing through a driveway to run him over, as well as a massive pipe bomb that was stuck in his front yard but didn't explode. Aerosmith, pissed off that he kept being harassed by the FBI, sold the printing press and attempted to evict Rockwell and family from their home. With no money, no home, no job, Thora's family paid to bring her and the children back to Iceland. And Rockwell was devastated. Rockwell's first marriage had ended because his first wife, Judy, was too independent, which he found sexually repulsive. In his autobiography, Rockwell unknowingly admits that frustrations with his wife directly resulted in his deepening racism and anti-Semitism. On George and Judy's wedding night, 2 days before he was to deploy to another station, Judy tells Rockwell that in their marriage, there can be no boss, and that she wasn't ready for children. She then took contraceptives out of her luggage, which plunges Rockwell into an existential crisis. He wonders what is wrong with the world. His wife has cucked him with her liberal views of equality and independence, and on the train the next day he discovers that his sleeper reservation had been double booked by the train service, and that another man, quote, a 300-pound yellow-skinned fat Hebrew, end quote, was already stowing his luggage in the sleeper. Now, instead of placing blame on the train service, Rockwell focused his rage and marital disappointment on the Jewish man, writing, quote, "This is the first time in my life I can remember hating a Jew as a Jew, but I submit that so would anybody hate him, even my pious fellow Gentiles who now counsel me to tolerance and love," end quote. In another instance, Rockwell strikes his first wife, Judy, for serving him a small portion of ham after she told him they could not afford to splurge on a steak. At first, Rockwell had commended her for being careful with money, but looking at the ham on his plate, split between the two of them, filled him with rage. Rockwell blames Judy's, quote, illogicalness on the much larger problem of women being educated to believe that they are the equal of men. Encouraged to study at university and take jobs instead of learning to be housewives and mothers. Does this sound like anybody in modern politics? He considers this a deliberate unraveling of traditionalism, a belief embodied by his time in New York City, where he so often encountered people of diverse mixed races that in his opinion, they stopped being human. He saw this in the myth of equality as the result of Marxism, which ultimately led back to a Jewish plot against the world. Judy was a victim of Marxism, and he was suffering for it. Thora, on the other hand, an Icelandic woman of pure Nordic blood, even though she was part Canadian, with blonde hair and fair skin, put her husband and his dreams ahead of her own, and he was better for it. He wasn't just better for having Thora around, she made him whole. So, when Thora left Rockwell and returned to Iceland with the children, he was a fucking wreck. The separation was meant to be temporary until he could get back on his feet and provide for his family. He received a letter from his mother-in-law stating the conditions of Thora's return. A steady job and minimum income. That's it. Rockwell's legal troubles and debts mounted. Aerosmith had traveled to New York to provide testimony to the FBI, which has been released via FOIA request and is fascinating. And his relationship with Rockwell was over. Most of Rockwell's acquaintances and connections wanted nothing to do with him after the synagogue bombing. His family and most of the furniture in the house had been shipped off to Iceland, his livelihood sold out from under him. He was an utter disaster, and he commented to his own mother that he might kill himself. Don't feel bad for him. In his darkest hour, a package arrived from one of his earliest supporters, James K. Warner. Inside, an 18-foot-long Nazi flag. Most rational people, if caught up in legal and financial trouble, accused of bombing a synagogue, being called by reporters and visited by the FBI, their family attacked, they might feel disgust upon unfurling a massive testament to the ideology that unraveled their lives. Not Rockwell. Rockwell unfolded that flag and hung it on his living room wall, then assembled a shrine with candles and a bookshelf and a plaque of Hitler, and proceeded to have an emotional collapse in front of it. Quote, "Goose pimples rose all over me, my hair stood on end, my eyes filled with tears of love for this greatest of all conquerors. My breath came in little gasps," end quote. He then salutes Hitler, shouts Sieg Heil, and determines that he is meant to carry on where Hitler left off. As for Rockwell's wife, Thora, she's gone for good. Rockwell manages to fly to Iceland, but he is quite coldly rejected by Thora, whose well-to-do family has convinced her that Rockwell is a piece of shit. Good for them. At the time, there was a very strong belief among Rockwell's friends that if Thora had taken him back, he probably would have abandoned all of his goals in the United States and lived out his days in Iceland, happily playing with his pure Nordic, part Canadian, part American children. Firmly rejected by his one true living love, Rockwell turned to his second love, Hitler. Rockwell triples down and decides to not only be open about his Nazi beliefs, he creates a brand new political party, the American Nazi Party, in 1959. Just a side note, recall that when Rockwell was having doubts about his first wife, Judy, he turned his anger outward towards a Jewish man on a train, but restrained himself. Having been rejected by Thora, whom he loved wholeheartedly, Rockwell turned his anger towards the entire world. Just an observation on fragile, insecure men becoming unhinged when they don't get their way with women. From 1959 through 1967, Rockwell's American Nazi Party would grow to approximately 500 members. Though this number is quite likely inaccurate, I don't think they ever topped more than like 100 or 200. Ever since Rockwell attended the 1950 Christian Nationalist Convention in Los Angeles, Rockwell had entrenched himself with every far-right, right-wing, and extremist group he could find. As he and his first wife Judy moved around the country in the 50s, Rockwell busied himself both in reading extremist literature in library stacks and making connections with local politicians and political parties, attending rallies, speeches, conventions, and collecting racist tracts wherever he found them. Through Rockwell's extensive network of connections, Rockwell established the American Nazi Party throughout the United States, with divisions in California, Chicago, New Orleans, and Dallas, in addition to his headquarters in Arlington, Virginia. Rockwell had auxiliary youth organizations serving as a front for the ANP, the Fighting American Nationalists, or FAN, which were spread all across the U.S. and which Rockwell referred to as future American Nazis. Now, I know what you're thinking. I just said that their numbers probably were never any more than 100 or 200, and yet I'm saying that they have these chapters all over the United States. In many cases, these chapters were just P.O. boxes opened by one individual wherever they were. But we'll get to that in a bit. The ANP's recruitment of young men with criminal backgrounds, as well as his engagement with high schoolers, would result in an October 1961 FBI investigation involving two Maryland high school girls, aged 13 and 14, who attested to agents that they and other high school girls, known to the party as the Maryland Group, had had sex with and been fondled by members of Rockwell's ANP. One girl informed agents that one member of the ANP had tried to rape her in his car at the Wheaton Plaza shopping center, but a police car parked beside them at the last minute and he climbed off of her. The girls described party members suggesting they form an auxiliary group for girls called the Naziettes, and some of the girls, for their part, bought khaki dresses and borrowed armbands from the adult members. The girls were interviewed at home and at school in front of both their parents and their teachers or principals, and just a few days later, a man named by one of the girls was arrested on charges of, quote, carnal knowledge of a young girl. He was a former U.S. Marine Corps member discharged on bad conduct in 1960. As the man was asked about his associations with the American Nazi Party, he informed police that he had recently broken with Rockwell and wished to share information with the FBI on the party's activities. Now, there are a lot of FBI files on Rockwell and the American Nazi Party and Rockwell's associates, but whoever they picked up on child rape charges gives us a clearer picture of the party than Rockwell ever does. Entry into the American Nazi Party required the former Marine to be finger and palm printed and photographed, then placed on a 30-day trial during which he had to show, quote, his courage in physical combat in 2 street actions. He stated the street actions consisted of picketing at various Negro establishments, end quote. After the Marine was inducted into the party, he became Rockwell's personal bodyguard. Rockwell had several bodyguards, many of whom are publicly known, and are left unredacted in the FBI files. This informant was redacted. According to the informant, Rockwell pretty much followed Hitler's model for the American Nazi Party. Per the FBI notes, quote, the ANP will purge people in following their ideas by setting up concentration camps and gassing them. He advised that 80% of the Jewish people in the United States would be so destroyed. The ANP also advocates withdrawing citizenship of all Negroes in this country. Further, the party will deport all liberal and conservative Americans and all Christians who have played into the hands of the Jewish people. All Jewish synagogues will be turned into gas chambers for the destruction of the Jewish people, end quote. They're all assholes. They're all pieces of shit. The American Nazi Party operated under even more front organizations such as the Reich Party in Denmark, the British National Party of Canada, the British National Party in London, the American National Party in New York and Washington, D.C., the States' Rights Party in Chicago, and of course the Fighting American Nationalists in Washington, D.C. And again, all of these affiliates across the country and around the world were, in many cases, just one person setting up a mailbox. The American Nazi Party was welcomed by the Ku Klux Klan in Atlanta during a 1961 picketing event at Grady High School, having been provided money by the local Grand Wizard for a more comfortable stay while in town. The informant also notes that several Pentecostal ministers were members of the party, and that the ANP received literature from the office of Senator Strom Thurmond, specifically his brochures on the freedom of speech for military officers, because Thurmond believed that military officers should have the freedom of speech to espouse white supremacist beliefs. The informant also made note that Rockwell sent literature to U.S. Army officers, and that at least one active service member was an official card-carrying member of the ANP. The primary activities of the ANP were organizing and participating in picketing demonstrations, getting into physical altercations with groups such as the NAACP, distributing pamphlets and stickers, and giving public speeches. When the ANP took to the road, they did so in Rockwell's hate bus, probably one of the most enduring images of the American Nazi Party from this time. It was a blue and white Volkswagen van with the words, "We do hate race mixing, we hate Jew communism," painted on the back, which they used in the summer of 1961 to travel from Virginia to New Orleans, following and harassing the Freedom Riders, stopping along the way for photo ops and harassment. Further, the informant also confirms many of the details provided by the underage girls who initiated the investigation, stating that Rockwell was aware of the girls' ages and that he'd given them the name shower troopers, in addition to calling them Naziettes. Rockwell was also aware that one of his adult party members had lied about a girl's age on a marriage certificate. She was 16 at the time, and according to the report, Rockwell said the girls needed to have, quote, "lots of little Nazis to clean up the world situation," end quote. While Rockwell had grand plans and a lot of connections and a seemingly widespread network, FBI investigators found that membership was not as extensive as it seemed. The informant suggested membership in the ANP was as high as 6,000, all across the United States. But in the FBI's investigation, they found that there may have been no more than 100 actual dues-paying, card-carrying members of Rockwell's ANP. The Oklahoma division, for example, was just a P.O. box set up in the ANP's name by a 15-year-old who wanted to join the party. The San Francisco division had an estimated 4 or 5 members, the Glendale division had no more than 10, and the Chicago division, the ANP's largest, had a maximum of 12 members. That's not to undersell Rockwell's influence. For example, in May 1963, 17-year-old John E. Collins Jr. and 2 other classmates obtained a submachine gun and shot up the homes of their teacher and principal. Collins Jr. identified as a Nazi and had visited Rockwell's Nazi Party headquarters in Arlington twice over the past year and had a large quantity of Nazi literature in his bedroom. Despite the low membership, official ANP members were rabid Nazis and, as described by the FBI, psychotic. Daniel Burros, who was promoted to lieutenant and national secretary in 1961, was a Brooklyn-raised Jewish man who had attended Hebrew school in Queens and had his bar mitzvah at Talmud Torah in Richmond Hill. Burros had blonde hair and in high school began identifying as German instead of Jewish, collecting World War II German war paraphernalia, eventually turning further and further into Nazism, developing a signature that incorporated a swastika, and sending letters with brutal depictions of Jews being murdered. In 1958, Burros attempted to donate bail money to John Casper, a KKK member, pro-segregationist riot insider, and suspect in some school and synagogue bombings, but Casper returned the bail money to Burros because, in his opinion, Burros was too pro-Nazi and too extreme. Burros joined the American Nazi Party in 1960 and refused to undergo a background check by security officer Roger Foss, and Rockwell allowed the exception. This infuriated Foss, who said it was a security risk because Burros was, quote, obviously Jewish. But Burros stayed and climbed the ranks because he was a good printer and Rockwell needed him to run the press. He designed and printed merchandise for the National Socialist Bulletin, such as, and I apologize, soap wrappers that read, made from the finest Jewish fat, and a joke Jew pass to be handed to the last Jew in line for the gas chamber. He also wrote the ANP's official Stormtroopers Manual. Burros was known for having a sadistic sense of humor towards torturing and murdering Jews. He shared descriptive torture fantasies with the group, which disgusted several party members. In 1961, after the hate bus tour throughout the South, Burros and John Patler began to disagree with Rockwell and schemed to get Roger Foss demoted. Burros officially resigned from his position and broke ties with Rockwell and the Nazi Party by jumping out the second-story window of the Arlington headquarters. Burros and Patler fled to New York, where they started a magazine called Kill, dedicated to the annihilation of the enemies of white people, in which he advocated murder and attacked Rockwell and the American Nazi Party. They formed the American National Party but had no money, and Burros eventually joined the National Renaissance Party, where he and party leader James Madole bonded over their shared interest in Francis Yockey and their hatred of Rockwell. John F. Kennedy's assassin, Lee Harvey Oswald, had Dan Burros in his address book, and as a result, Burros would later go around wearing a button that said Lee Harvey Oswald Fan Club. Burros and Madole would have a falling out. Burros would join the KKK and become the Grand Dragon and King Kleagle of New York. Now, we are getting off on a tangent with Burros, but it is important to understand what kind of batshit crazy assholes were drawn to the Nazi Party. Burros was outed as a member of the KKK by the New York Journal American in October of 1965, and the next day he was fired from his job. The New York Times followed up a few days later with a more in-depth article about Burros' affiliation with the American Nazi Party. Now, this is where things take a dark yet funny turn for Burros. An FBI agent who had been following Burros for a while and knew that he was Jewish but only learned about his KKK affiliation through the newspaper, tipped off New York Times reporter McCandlish Phillips to his Jewish background. Once Phillips confirmed Burros' bar mitzvah, he published the article State Klan Leader Hides Secret of Jewish Origin on October 31st. Later that same day, when the article came out, Burros would shoot himself in the chest with poor aim, then shoot himself in the head. His last words were, quote, "Long live the white race, I've got nothing more to live for." Rockwell, for his part, would posthumously praise Burros as best he could, considering that Burros was, after all, Jewish. Rockwell wrote a eulogy of sorts, quote, "Burros hated himself and his Jewishness, and went a step further, planning to murder them all. It killed him," end quote. Rockwell's American Nazi Party was small, but Rockwell's ego was enormous. He boasted to interviewers that he strictly followed the letter of the law and never engaged in violence, that his and his party's objective was to maximally express their rights under the U.S. Constitution. But he regularly wrote of extermination and an internalized violence that he wanted to unleash on the world. When trying to win over new followers or donors, he boasted that the party was flush with cash, $75,000 in the bank. The reality was that Rockwell spent what little money came in, and the FBI noted that party members mostly ate beans and canned hash. And there was a rumor that in the early years they had taken to eating canned dog food. Oh, I forgot to mention, at the ANP headquarters, all these little stormtroopers just lived together, like in a big sweaty dorm. The utilities at their headquarters in Arlington were regularly disconnected for non-payment. Rockwell's alimony payments to Judy were either late or non-existent. The hate bus was repossessed. FBI agents assigned to tailing Rockwell noted that the party headquarters was a dump. The most significant moment of Rockwell's career came in 1965, when he was interviewed by Playboy magazine by Alex Haley. Haley, who was in the middle of writing the autobiography of Malcolm X and would go on to write Roots, the Saga of an American Family, called Rockwell at the ANP headquarters to assure Rockwell that he wasn't Jewish. However, Haley did not inform Rockwell that he was, in fact, African American. Haley interviewed Rockwell 4 times at the Arlington ANP headquarters before writing the article, and the two would correspond back and forth after the interviews were done and the article was published. Rockwell understood that the exposure in Playboy could result in an uptick in membership and fees, but such growth never happened. What did happen was that Playboy magazine brought the concept of Holocaust denialism to an audience of 3.6 million readers. Up until then, Holocaust denialism was a very obscure fringe belief, and Playboy brought it out into the open. While the publicity did not result in any significant membership growth, it did happen to produce the most significant American Nazi Party member, William Luther Pierce. Pierce was an assistant professor of physics at Oregon State University before moving to Connecticut in 1965 to take a job at Pratt & Whitney as a senior aerospace researcher. Pierce had been a member of the John Birch Society, which Rockwell called, quote, a sort of kindergarten for the Nazi Party, end quote. Pierce would later say of the John Birch Society, quote, the two topics on which I wanted an intelligent discussion, race and Jews, were precisely the two topics Birch Society members were forbidden to discuss, end quote. Prior to the move to Connecticut, Pierce began corresponding with Rockwell, impressed with his leadership, vision, education, and military service. While at Pratt & Whitney, a wildcat strike broke out and Pierce attempted to drive through a crowd of 1,000 protesters. Pierce did not make it through. Like Rockwell, Pierce's white extremist beliefs were the result of self-indoctrination and isolation in library stacks. He quit Pratt & Whitney and moved his family to Virginia to join Rockwell and found a new magazine, National Socialist World, which was the mouthpiece for the World Union of National Socialists, which was the umbrella group for global neo-Nazi organizations. They liked working together, but Pierce would not officially join the party until Rockwell changed the name and scope of the party in 1967. While Rockwell did start to bring in some more money from speaking fees following the Playboy interview, it was still not enough to grow the American Nazi Party, and besides, Rockwell's dictator attitude caused major rifts in the organization. One group of 4 party members splintered off to form the Aryan Unity, while Rockwell maintained a white power faction focusing on white unity. In 1967, Rockwell changed the party name to the National Socialist White People's Party, got rid of the swastika, and started saying white power instead of Sieg Heil. Most likely, this was due to Rockwell's grand political aspirations, believing he would become president by 1972, but needed to make the American Nazi Party more palatable. In March 1967, Rockwell expelled John Patler from the Nazi Party, who had served as editor for the party's Stormtrooper magazine. On August 25, 1967, a pissed-off Patler followed Rockwell to a laundromat. As Rockwell started his car to leave, Patler shot Rockwell in the chest with a German military-issue 7.63 Mauser. Rockwell crawled out of his car and died in the parking lot. The bullshit doesn't quite stop right there. Culpeper National Cemetery approved Rockwell's burial as an honorably discharged veteran, but insisted that no Nazi insignias be worn in the cemetery and rejected the party's request to provide an all-white honor guard. And because they were assholes, the American Nazi Party assembled a uniformed Nazi funeral procession and attempted to enter the National Cemetery, where they were refused entrance by the cemetery superintendent, Edward Maxwell, along with state and local police and 66 military policemen who had been flown in by helicopter. Maxwell, the MPs, and Rockwell's corpse stood at a stalemate for 6 hours. American Nazi Party members refused to remove their swastika armbands. The standoff resulted in several arrests, with military police first restraining Army Private First Class James DeWitt, who broke ranks with the military police and jumped into formation with the Nazis. Party member Doug Niles jumped on the roof of the hearse and riled up the Nazis before charging the MPs and getting arrested. Chris Vidnovich from Chicago replaced Niles on the roof of the hearse and began chanting Heil Hitler, then leapt into the crowd of military police and then was arrested. Nazi Mike Stewart also charged the MPs head first and was arrested. After 6 hours, the general assigned to the cemetery informed the party that Rockwell's approval for burial had been withdrawn by the Department of the Army. The Nazis packed up their funeral procession and drove 65 miles back to Arlington, and the next day, the Nazis had Rockwell cremated. Rockwell's deputy commander, Matt Cole, took over the American Nazi Party after Rockwell's death, and under his leadership, the party began to splinter further. However, Rockwell's influence will stretch far beyond his death, and the American Nazi Party, under its new name, the National Socialist White People's Party, will remain under Cole's leadership until 2014. Rockwell's dream of uniting the American right-wing parties under a large white nationalist umbrella did not happen in his lifetime, but Rockwell's influence will be felt for decades. If we had a large corkboard and red string, we could draw connections between Rockwell and contemporary alt-right and far-right and right extremist organizations and personalities. It simply cannot be overstated how influential Rockwell will be for the future of white supremacy. And because the deaths of Alex Peretti and Rachel Good are fresh on all our minds, I need to explain that Rockwell is directly responsible for the far-right mindset that justifies their deaths. Rockwell popularized the term race traitor to describe how whites lose white privilege when they associate with persons of color. Make no mistake, when white people are killed in the streets for protecting minorities, it's not because they're agitators or domestic terrorists or because they're getting in between federal agents in the middle of whatever the fuck they're doing in Minnesota. It's because the state and the party views them as race traitors, a crime punishable by death. This was Unfuck the Poor.